So, hello everyone, and thank you so much for coming. In just a second, I'm gonna spotlight this thing. And thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And this is basically our first Netvio Skillshare workshop, and it's going to be like a monthly thing. Every month, we're going to have someone else, and we're going to host someone in relation to the music industry. Okay, we have mastering today with the awesome Dan Fur, and we're gonna have like a promotion stuff, and we're going to have. I'm sorry, I'm admitting on other people here, and about promotion and about Spotify and about vocal training and about production and Ableton and a lot of stuff. And so it's very exciting. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who helped us pull this thing off. My brother in crime, Atlas Castle, the co-creator of Netvio, and Stephanie Don't Mess with Juan for helping us producing this thing. And thank you to all the Netvios and anyone who is not in Netvio that are here. So basically, I just want to take 2 minutes. For those who are not from Netvio, I just want to explain 1 minute on Netvio, and then we're gonna start this thing. Okay, so um, can everyone see my screen? Oh, righty, cool. So all right, so Netvio, music should be celebrated, not ranked. This is our motto, and we like it. And Netvio, as most of you know, it's community. It's an online community. We are a growing community of musicians and music producers from all around the world. We hang out together in the digital space, mostly on Instagram, and we have a lot of stuff coming up for Netvio. And it doesn't matter if you're a member or not, just hang around in our space. And we have monthly challenges, music challenges in Instagram. We got monthly online workshops such as this one. And we also are starting again the Netvio live sessions. Okay, so every month we're gonna have a different exclusive set from another musician. It's going to be on YouTube, so we're going to be all over the place, and it's always free. We are here just to support each other on our musical and personal journey. Okay, it's not a business; it's a community, and this is us. Recognize yourself. Just hanging around in the Zoom for no particular reason, but having fun. And so if it's something that speaks to you and you're not part of Netvio, so you can start by like following us on Instagram, following us on YouTube, start using the Netvio hashtags in your posts, okay? And start to engage with other musicians using the Netvio hashtag. It's not like a necessity, but it's just a great way to bypass the Instagram algorithm and check out the other members of this wonderful community. And I just wanted to invite everyone next week to our new line of Netvio live sessions. We're gonna have Congo Doom, and for anyone who doesn't know him, he's like a London-based electronic music producer, and he's doing very dark electronic, awesome music. So you can also, set a reminder on YouTube and you can come there. I would love to see you there. And now that we got this out of the way, um, Dan, I want to say hello to Dan Fur. I'm gonna add a spotlight here. And guys, I recommend you to watch on speaker view and not gallery view. It's gonna be very helpful for you because Dan is going to share his screen in just a minute, and it's gonna be more convenient. So, Dan, what's up, my man?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good. It's apart from losing an hour last night, things can't complain.
Yeah, we got this thing in Israel as well, but I'm not sure when, but it's not today, and I didn't know that you guys have it too.
Yeah, let me.
And
Sorry, someone was just commenting. I'm a little quiet, so I'll turn up my gain. How's things sounding now?
oh yeah, now it's sounding very good.
Perfect. Okay, good.
Anyway, so this is like a pilot episode of the workshop, and we just want to try a little thing to get to know you a little bit better, but not like in the straightforward way. I'm going to do like a very, very fast questionnaire, okay? I'm going to ask some stupid questions, and you're going to answer the fast as you can, okay? Like the first thing that comes to your head, you're going to answer. It's going to take 2 minutes, and then we're going to the workshop. Are you ready?
No, I'm never ready for this type of stuff. But
Are you ready? Okay. So the first question, and it's the most important one. Are you a cat person or a dog person?
oh, dog! I got my pup Willow downstairs, and she just sleeps with me to the point that
Oh,
sometimes night.
okay, it's the first one. Favorite color?
Blue
Favorite DAW?
doll.
Like digital audio workstation.
Okay. Ableton for like music making, but like Reaper for anything serious.
Awesome. Favorite 90s pop star?
90s pop star. Oh, that's a tough one. I can't even think of any off the top of my head. I mean, who's a 90s
The
pop
first
star?
one.
Oh, I don't even know any right now. Oh, I'm drawing a blank. I'm gonna say
Okay.
because they're from 90s, but they're not pop at all. But anyways, let's move on.
Oh, there we got kind of poppy. Tears in Heaven or Highway to Hell?
Probably Highway to Hell. I mean, historically, I loved AC/DC, but yeah.
All right. And one thing you would take to a lonely island that is not a musical instrument or a cell phone.
Oh, a tool like a hammer, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, that's practical, man.
You're not a
Is
hammer. That's a bad
is
tool.
hot dog a sandwich, and why?
I would say yeah. It's something between two pieces of bread. It's a foreign sandwich, but yeah, I'd say it's a sandwich.
It's a discussion, or it's like no, it's a sandwich for sure.
Yeah, I'd say like it. Yeah, it's a sandwich. I don't know. It's a discussion. Yeah, I'm not gonna like sway people, but I think
I'm just messing around, man. Yeah, I guess it's a sandwich. Where do you see yourself 10 years from now?
I'd love to be working on some big films, doing post production for some real feature films and stuff like that.
Awesome. I'm sure we will see that happening. And name one conspiracy you believe to be true.
Oh, one conspiracy I believe to be true. Oh, definitely that aliens built the pyramids for sure. Yeah, aliens are doing all sorts of things. I mean, like
That's
they're
not a conspiracy. That happened for real.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What? How long have you been doing music?
Um, I started playing music when I was really little, but like actually seriously, I'd say 4 years now, 4 or 5 years. Yeah.
Wow. Only 4 or 5 years.
I like played jazz bass in jazz band in high school and stuff. I didn't really take it seriously. I never really realized how to read notes, so I just sort of like filled my way through it with ear, and my teacher hated me because I wasn't playing the right walking. Here we are, and that's
And
the
you're
story.
doing pretty good. Yeah. What type of cheese are you?
Hmm. I think I'm a good feta. I'm pretty delicious and rich, but I can be a little crumbly at times.
I get it. And you got a little bit of a Greek vibe
Yeah.
on your face. So a
Known
Greek
that.
god, yeah. And what was your first Halloween costume?
Oh, the first one I remember being like that I chose myself was a pillow.
A pillow.
I like stuffed a bunch of pillows in my jacket and stuff, and I was just like a little puffball walking around.
Awesome. Okay. In one sentence, how would you sum up the internet?
The internet. Oh, it's like the Wild West, I would say.
Exactly. Okay, man. And just one last question. If you had one message to the world, what would it be?
Just be nice. It's all we need. Just be nice and life will work out.
Yeah, simple, but less is more, and I love it. Dude, thank you. It was fun. And guys, so Paul, I'm going to pass the torch to you. You're going to share your screen. I'm going to, be on the side, and I want to learn as well because I think I got a lot to learn about mastering. And guys, after this workshop, we're gonna have a Q&A with Paul. So yeah, so if you have any questions, don't try to write them down during this stuff. After the workshop, we will have time for questions, and then he can answer as much as he can until everyone will need to go to sleep. Cool, man. So the stage is yours. Thank you so much for doing this, and Enjoy. And just a second, I'm making sure. Yeah, now you can share your screen.
Perfect. Awesome.
So
Okay. Just
yeah.
yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. Just want to say first off a little bit about some of my background and how how I got into mastering and stuff. So initially, I've only really been doing music and working in DAWs for about 4 or 5 years now, but I was fortunate enough to have met a really good mentor about 3 years ago who's actually recorded Liam Neeson is all I really need to say about his caliber of talent. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to work, under him for the past 3 years, doing all sorts of things from, recording and producing, mixing and mastering, as well as doing a lot of post production for film and TV. So it's been pretty much I've been working full time in audio about 2 years now, and there's pretty much no looking back for me at this point. It's what I love to do, and I almost love it more than songwriting and producing itself at this point. It's sort of just like a giant puzzle that it's always going to fit together, and it's always possible to fit together, but there's no essential right way to fit it together, which is what's so appealing to me. There's all these different ways to achieve something that essentially is the same product but is ultimately so different, and I find that very fascinating. So anyways, without further ado, we'll dive into the fun stuff. And I've got a little slideshow here to, okay, where are we going? What happened? You were sharing your screen. Oh yeah, okay. So just want to make sure everybody can see what my screen and everything. They see this little slideshow here. Where's the chat? I need to check the chat. Chat, there we go. Yep, okay, perfect. Okay, hide this chat over here, and I'll just check it when I need to. Okay, so awesome. Thank you everyone for coming out today. This is a little mastering workshop that I put on, and for the sake of Zoom audio being what it is, this is going to be much more of a conceptual based workshop as opposed to examples. There's going to be a lot of examples, and I'm going to kind of show you in terms of processes how I use some of these plugins and ideas, but it's really going to be very minimal on the hardcore listening side of things, just because Zoom's not really going to be able to pick up that stuff, but there will be showing. So if you have headphones and good listening systems, it will help you. So essentially, first off, a little bit of insight on what mastering is. So essentially, it's literally just the final process that adds any polish and removes any minor issues. And the key word here is minor issues, because a golden rule that's been thrown around in audio since like the 80s essentially is just you can't polish a turd. So any major issues that go into mastering are really like, in order to fix those issues, you're going to have to do serious compromises to other parts of the song to balance that thing out, and in which case it's a constant give and take, which doesn't really often produce the best results. So that's why when possible, all the issues that can be fixed in the mix is where you want to fix them. And ideally, some of these issues come down to the recording process. Now, fortunately, with a lot of what we're doing today is, there's a lot of software and there's a lot of computer stuff. So there's not really that recording aspect as intently, but that is still a very key thing about it. And you can't fix a poor recording in mixing, and similarly you can't really fix a poor mix in mastering. So that's just a key distinction. But all mastering really is like I say, adding this final little bit of glue and polishing touch to make it sound just a little bit more sparkly, full, and balanced. And so that brings me to, there's two different kinds of masters that I'll often do. Or there's only two kinds of masters that I'll do really: a stereo master and a stem master. And so essentially the difference between those two is, if we go into Reaper here, a stem master would be essentially, the song is broken down into stems. I have the drum beat, I've got this bass line, I've got this synth, and then I've got this pluck that's playing. And so then I would master each of those stems individually and then glue them together through the master bus. And that's what would a stem master be. A stereo master would just be essentially, just take one of these, everything else is just cut out. The whole song is just in one stem, and then we master that one stem. So a stem master gives us a lot more capabilities to EQ certain problem frequencies and deal with issues and glue things together. And it also gives us a lot more capabilities to do busing, which is what we're going to talk about next. But a stereo master, sometimes that's all you get. Sometimes there's just not a lot of options for things, and all you have is a stereo master. So there's benefits to both, and often, like historically, a stereo master was kind of the only way to go. just because technology was a limiting factor. But now stem mastering is becoming much more prominent of a reality, and especially because stem DJing is starting to become a concept as well. So a lot of people are liking to have their stems mastered independently to be able to do some stem DJing. So there's all sorts of reasons why this came into reality. And personally, I think it's a better way to go, because not only does it allow the mastering engineer more capabilities to solve the problems, it also gives them more ability to glue things together through busing, which is what we're going to talk about next. And so busing is an interesting topic that I find very confusing when you're first getting started out, but it's quite simple. And I think one of the reasons why it gets confusing is because there's two different sort of concepts when you talk about busing and grouping. One is essentially your sends, which is, Ableton makes it very easy to show. Essentially, your sends are these little sends here, and when you go into the session view here, it's already pre-wired, so you can just route as much to the sends as you want. But then there's also things called groups, which are different than sends, right? You can then take a couple of tracks, group them together, and then process them all at once. And that's, all DAWs are able to do this, and they all have their sends and their groups. And so they're very different, right? Because a group has all the signals going directly through the group, whereas a send or a bus is literally just sending another signal out to the send and then processing it differently. So it's doing it kind of in parallel. And so they're two very different beasts that are, very beneficial for getting things and, allowing things to sound gelled cohesively and just a little bit more color. But you kind of want to understand the difference between them. And I'm not going to talk about busing too much, because I think that's one of the easier concepts here. But I just want to, have the clear distinction between the two. And then I want to talk a little bit about kind of some of the busing that I like to use and how I like to apply it and stuff. So when it comes to mastering songs, often when I'm doing a stereo master, there's very little busing involved. Sometimes I'll do a little bit here and there, but like there's not a lot, because there's only so much I can do. There's occasional times where I will do very fancy busing where, let's say, the snare is very dull in a stereo master, in which case I can find the certain frequency that the snare is hitting at, and then I can just send a bus out to that just send a bus where I cut everything but that frequency, and then process that frequency a little bit more in order to bring out the snare. And so you can kind of bring out things a little bit, but it's hard to take things away. So that's why, busing in a stereo master is used a lot less, not never. I definitely I'll use a couple and everything, but it's just a lot less, because generally that's something you do in the mix if you were having a stereo master. But some of the buses that I like to use regularly when I'm doing my stem masters here is, I'll just open up this little thing here. This is just a template that I'll often have to open up for everything. And sometimes I'll use them all. Sometimes I'll not use all of them. And oftentimes I'll add more of them and not use all of them, kind of thing. It's just as a template that I find these are often basics. So I have two kinds of reverbs, a chamber and a plate. Oftentimes it goes a lot more than just the two. Sometimes there's a spring, sometimes there's a larger plate, sometimes there's a shorter plate, sometimes there's both, sometimes there's a lot of short room reverbs, sometimes there's some chambers. There's all sorts of variety, and it's just nice to have the variation, because it's one way to very easily glue things together. Different sorts of delays. I love a slap back delay to bring out some vocals or bring out a lead sort of thing. A 16-inch dotted delay, or 8-inch dotted delay, or an 1/8-inch delay is always good for busing in small amounts. And the key thing to talk about when using buses is less is more. It's oftentimes I'll be using these things and I'll be like, okay, well, let's send this at like minus 98 dB or something like that, and I'll do that for a couple of tracks. And it's like the most minute little bit, but it just adds a little bit when you start doing things, and you kind of want to understand how it's affecting the mix. So oftentimes, I'll bring it up to the point where I can hear it. And this is a very common trick that I'm sure some of you have heard. I'll bring it out to the point where I can hear it, and then I start ducking it away and ducking it away and ducking it away until it kind of fades away into, I don't really notice anymore. But then when you bypass it and trigger it back on, then you start to feel it a little bit more, right? And that's one of the benefits of buses. And so three other kinds of buses I'll almost always use is just a New York style compressor, just to sort of squash things a bit more. I'll use a Haas delay, which is basically kind of like a delay that acts almost like a reverb. I'll use an exciter to help bring out a little bit of top end, and I'll use this real ADT to add just a little bit of, it's kind of stereo image, but it's not really stereo image a little bit. It's kind of a little bit of a fancy bit of thing that I'll talk about later as well. And so those are just some common types of buses that I like to use on a regular basis. And, less is more, but more buses is better. And that's one of the beefs I have with Ableton particularly, is it only allows you to have up to 12 sends. And like, as you can see here, my template that I start off with is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 8 different buses right there. So like, if I'm doing some actual like work on film or TV or something like that, it's not uncommon to have up to 20 buses. Even sometimes when I'm mastering a song, it's not uncommon to have over 15 buses. And Ableton just is kind of annoying, which is one of the reasons why I switched to Reaper for the majority of big projects. And I love Ableton for working, but I think Reaper is just, it's amazing. And it's only $60. It's like, it's a piece of magic. But that's kind of my concept on buses. Less is more, but a lot of them is very valuable because it helps just sort of give a lot of different space. And there's no real wrong way or wrong effects to use in busing. But one thing I like to do is be wary about how that's affecting the other stuff. So oftentimes I'll have an EQ or some things to just cut out problem frequencies. Like this chamber, I know for a fact it's going to have some real, it's going to real beef up that low end and cause things to be muddy. And I don't need any sub reverb coming out of anything. Like that's not doing my low end any good. So I know if I cut it out, it's just going to be good. So, that's something that's fun to do. You can process your buses more than just one single effect, right? Like here, I also have a little bit of a console emulation to add a bit of color, which we'll again talk about later, but there's all sorts of things you can do. You don't want to limit yourself with your bus to just be one simple effect and move on. Like you can have chains in your bus that then sort of complicates the sound and makes it a little bit more rich as well. So off of busing onto stereo imaging. And so I just got some notes on my phone that I want to make sure I don't forget here. But yeah, so stereo imaging, what is stereo imaging? Well, this is basically the soundscape of your track is how to best describe stereo imaging. So like things on the left, things on the right, front and center, all of that sort of plays a good impact on how that song is perceived. So what are some of the problems that we find with stereo imaging? Well, there's a lot. So what I kind of wanted to do in this one is more so focus on a couple of key tips, and then there was a couple of key things that I wanted to talk about. The first tip I want to stress about stereo imaging is not all of the songs not all the sounds in your mix should be stereo. That is what you're doing, is then you're kind of just like making everything seem very wide. And one of the most important things for getting a good stereo image, and this goes across the board for basically getting a good mix in anything, is balance and contrast. So if all your sounds are stereo, you don't really have that contrast of what a mono sound sounds like, and therefore all your listener ever hears is stereo sounds, and they don't really feel the difference, so it stays pretty stagnant to them, right? And what a good stereo image is translating back and forth between mono signals and stereo signals, and kind of like pushing things all the way around, and using the space and using silence as well to kind of make sure that it feels like it has this depth to it. But if everything is just stereo, or similarly if everything is just mono, then it's all going to be very similarly in the same space, and that's going to cause problems. And another thing you want to avoid to do, which it sounds a little silly, is, well, no, it doesn't really sound silly, but you want to avoid what they call like a W mix as well. And what a W mix is essentially is like only using mono sounds and then hard stereo sounds. And so then that might sound a little confusing. It's like, well, what other sound sources are there, kind of thing? There's mono and stereo, right? Well, there's mono and stereo, but with any stereo signal, you can then shorten that signal to be less and less wide. So for instance, Ableton has this very easy a little bit of utility here. Let's see, where is it? Here we go. So it's got this little plugin called utility, and what it allows you to do is this width. So you can stack it all the way mono, or you can just make it 50% mono. So for instance, when we listen here, and I'm going to check the chat here to make sure the audio is all sounding good for this part of things as well. Okay, it's probably quiet. Okay. Gonna turn that octave down. Okay, I'm getting some weird delay going here. Let's just FX, turn delay and reverb off, and then okay. Well, I'll just sort of turn it up a little bit more. The sound for this isn't important. It's kind of a kind of a trashy sound for now, but it's just something I had and didn't really pay attention to. But anyways, this plugin is what's important. So what this thing allows us to do is if we go 100%, when we listen to it, look at the signal here. We see it's got a very dense sort of stereo image, right? There's lots on the left happening, then lots on the right, then it kind of wiggles back and forth. But what we can then do is we can take this width and we'll break it down to 50%. So when you have, for instance, one of the times I'll use this in every occasion is when I'm layering the same sound together. So say you're layering chords together and you want to make a really fat super saw. Oftentimes I'll keep the top end at 100, but when I start getting down to the lower octaves, I'll bring those lower octaves down to 75 and then down to 50 and then down to 25 as it gets lower and lower. And so what that does is it sort of sculpts like a little bit of a V shape for your sounds and allows everything to have a little bit of its own space. And what that also does is in these sounds, there's obviously overlapping frequencies. Even though you're playing different octaves, the harmonics are rising up. And so you don't want those opposite frequencies to clash. So if you start stacking them and having them all a little bit of a different width, then it gives each of those instruments a little bit of a different place in the mix and allows those frequencies just to sit nicely and on top of each other rather than just trying to fight for that exact same space. And again, that allows us to avoid what we call as that W mix, where everything's just on the edges or in the middle, because then you can kind of just start to shape things. And with your panning knob, then it's instead of it being like that, you've got it shaped to 50, and then you can pan it like that. So then you have it occupying this space rather than this space, and you can kind of do all sorts of things to shape your mix just with this little utility knob. And fortunately, there's other plugins that do that quite simply as well. Like one easy one that I'll use outside is just this Waves S1 stereo thing here. Is this no, this is the shuffler stereo. That's not the one I want. This one here. This one does essentially the same thing, right? It allows me to take the width and go from a 1, and I can just stack it down. This one's kind of fun because it actually allows me to change the asymmetry and actually allows me to rotate it a little bit. So this one gives me a little bit more control and direction out of exactly where I want to place it. And there's all sorts of different plugins that do this same concept, but the concept itself is quite simple. And you'd be amazed at when you're like, especially when you're layering like 3 different pads or 3 different chords on top of each other, you'd be amazed at what just putting 150, 175 in the top 100 does. It really just makes things sound full and opens things up a real lot. Let's see, where's my slides here? There we go. And on to my next point here. This other point here is pretty crucial for people using a lot of soft synths and presets, which, let's face it, is pretty much everyone writing electronic music these days. Even myself, I love sound design and creating patches, but there's so many great presets out there, you're silly not to use them. And so, but there is a couple of things you should be wary about when you use those presets. More often than not, those presets are made to sound good on their own. They're not made to sound great in a mix. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because sounding great on their own, you can always sculpt it to make it sound good in a mix. It's hard to make something sound bad sound good in a mix, kind of thing. But the problem with that is, especially when it comes down to stereo imaging, everything is so wide these days. Everything is like, oh man, no, these pads got to go whoosh, and then they got to come back, and it's like there's just so much depth to everything that they're doing, and a lot of it's not necessary in the context of an actual mix. If you're using a lot of different presets, you maybe want a few sounds like that, but if every sounds like that, well, then you're just dealing with that same problem where there's no real contrast and everything feels too wide and it lacks substance. So that's again where that stereo widening tool can come in very much handy, because you can take something that's extremely wide and then move it together. And then so now you don't necessarily have a mono signal. You've got kind of this in between mono and stereo signal where it's got stereo aspects to it, but it's not mono, right? And so that's a great way to create a lot of space and create a lot of opening in your mix. Number 3, this tip is a pretty simple one. This tip is just mirroring. So what mirroring essentially means is if there's two sounds that are a very similar frequency, well, then it's very nice to have them opposite sides of the stereo image, right? One left, one right. And sometimes it works great, other times it doesn't. There's some plugins that do this for you, like I have any doubler plugin is essentially doing exactly that. It's splitting them on the left and the right and kind of changing with the phasing and the delay a little bit to make them sound wider. But what mirroring essentially means is two different sounds that are similar, right? So if there's one melody in there, or if there's two different counter melodies playing, then having one on the left and one on the right is really nice, because it sort of has them playing this back and forth. Your center melody is right here and things are going back and forth kind of thing. This works all really great with backing vocals and shouts and stuff. They're really great to have kind of on the sides. And even, don't be afraid to hard pan it. Like I've hard coded panning is your friend, because it's often, didn't do that well, but panning is one of the most important concepts when it comes to dealing with a stereo image in a mix. Obviously, when you're dealing with a stereo image in mastering, you got to get a little bit more fancy with it. But when you're in a mix, and even when you're doing a stem master, panning is your best friend. Like it is one of the most important ways to get things to sound clean. And that's going to lead me into my last tip, that if you want a key element to stand out, like vocals or like a lead or something like that, like it doesn't necessarily need to be mono, because a lot of vocals do really well in this great open space, but having a mono aspect makes them stand out way clearer, especially on things like iPhone speakers, and it just makes them sound very front and center, that as a listener, you won't be able to not have that at the focal point. And one of the ways I'll often like to do that is through a bit of a mono bus. And so I'll just route a bit of the send through the vocals or through whatever I want to do, and then I'll send it to just a mono signal. I'll use mono plugins to keep the signal just straight and center, and that way that signal then has a mono aspect, but it doesn't take away the stereo image in any sort of way. It just makes it more front and center to kind of stack on top of things. Because if you think about it, from a listener point of view, like they're just sort of hearing things, and anything, like the way it works is just anything that goes front and center is obviously what they're going to focus on, because it's playing equally out of both speakers. There's no real left and right, and just the psychoacoustics of the brain is when we hear things coming directly at us, we think that they are right in front of us, and therefore we want to focus them on more. It's just the way our ears send the signals to our brains. And so if you keep them center, then the listener has really no choice but to pay attention to them. And that's what you kind of want as a mixing engineer, is find your focal points and keep them key. And so that's kind of the main concept I want to talk about stereo imaging. There was one last thing I wanted to say. What was it? Do I have a next tip? No, I got to find it. There was one last thing I know I wanted to say. Okay, no, maybe I got it all. I did want to talk a little bit about mid-side EQ. I'm going to talk about that a bit more in the EQ side of things, but mid-side EQ is another great way to get a good stereo image. Oh, I figured out what I wanted to talk about after, right? Okay. Mid-side EQ is another great way to get stereo image, but again, I'll talk about that in the frequency section a little bit more. But the last thing I want to talk about is, like I say, it's not never that I'll want to widen things. More often than not, when I'm mixing and mastering, people send stuff that's a little bit too wide and everything needs to be brought down a little bit or narrowed in some aspect through using that, just image narrower. But of course, there are instances where sometimes you need to have a little bit of more thing, or a little bit more sort of fanciness. And in which case, I'll just use my Izotope Imager. I'm only on ozone 7, but whatever, it does me what it needs to do. And I'm not going to go into too much depth with it here because realistically, all I'll ever do is maybe push the top end up, like up to about a 15 at most, and I'll kind of play with these a little bit. And generally speaking, the rule of thumb is higher frequency sounds do better in a more wider stereo image, and more low frequency sounds and especially sub basses do way better in more of a mono signal. And obviously there's a little bit of times where you can break those rules either way, but generally speaking, that's a rule that I like to base a lot of my decisions on. And that's kind of all I want to talk about for stereo imaging for now. So then we're going to go into, here we go. Now we're going to talk about dynamics a little bit, I think. Oh no, frequency, fun stuff. Okay, yeah. So what is frequency processing? Well, isn't it just basically EQ? Well, yes, but way, way more fine-tuned than that. And I think EQing and frequency processing is one of the most overlooked concepts of mixing and mastering, because everyone's like, oh yeah, it's all about compression and all that, and dynamics and everything and stuff. They kind of just like focus on that because EQ sounds so simple in theory. But this, in my opinion, is easily the most important and most integral part of getting a good mixer master, because what frequencies you're hearing dictate how things sound. Like you can compress a good sound. Like a good sound can be compressed a couple of different ways and still sound good. But if the sound isn't like, doesn't have the right sounds, doesn't have the right frequencies, you can compress it all you want, and some compressors might make it sound good and some might not, but it's going to be a lot harder to get that sounding good. So when it comes down to frequency processing, there's a lot of things that can be done. So the first thing I'll often do when I'm thinking about a mix is use a de-esser. Now, most people, it's funny, I made a post about this a little while ago, and a lot of people are like, oh, and I never thought about using a de-esser on anything but vocals. And I mean, to me, that's such a funny concept, because a de-esser is nothing more than a specific dynamic compressor. It's like a very simple multi-band dynamic compressor that anytime goes above, it's very, it doesn't really distinguish between a vocalist or a resonant peak on a synth. It doesn't know. It just hears a signal that's coming in. It's like, oh, resonant peak, I want to tame this. And so I'll always use a de-esser multiple times. Sometimes I'll have 3 of them on a signal just to clean up a bunch of different resonant peaks. My personal favorite here is the Suppressor by Oxford. It is one of the most transparent de-essers I think I've ever found. It just does me wonderful. So essentially, for anyone that doesn't really know how a de-esser works, it's basically like a compressor. You can set the threshold. So I can go, or you can set the frequency range that you want. So generally, sibilance occurs up and around 5K to 8K, somewhere around there, around the 6K range. And so if we take these drums, we'll just take a peek, because oftentimes drum cymbals can have a bit of resonant peaks. And let's just play it back. So you see that little reduction bar. Anytime those hi-hats peak above my threshold of minus 25.6 dBs, then those hi-hats are then being reduced a little bit. And in this example, it's hard to say how much it needs it, but a lot of times when you're mixing and stuff, this is a very great way, especially with a stereo master. If I'm given something that has very like piercing hi-hats, well, what I can do is be like, okay, well, where's the problem with those hi-hats? Find the initial little problem, find the frequency, and just try and cut that out as transparently as possible. And that's why I love this suppressor, because it is the most transparent suppressor or de-esser that I've managed to find yet. I mean, obviously I haven't used them all, but it definitely does the trick best for me. But any old de-esser will work wonderfully for this exact concept, right? It's just basically a very simple multi-band compressor that you can use to just tame out some problem frequencies. And this can be used in anything from drums to synths. If we go down here, check out this little pad here. Let's go add another. Oh, where'd it go? Oh, I just distort the shit out of it. Okay. Suppressor. If we go here, like this is one of my favorite tools. This is probably a good 10% of my mastering process is just taming out problem frequencies with this or something of the sorts. let's see, we listen to this pad. So here we see like, this can easily be carved out by an EQ as well, but oftentimes you can use an EQ and it can, there's a lot of dynamics in some synth parts. Let's say you use an EQ and then on the tail of this thing, what happens is it starts to sound dull. You've tamed the peak, but then it starts to sound dull on the tail. Well, you want that tail because, for instance, in this song, it looks like the bass is fading out. So there's a lot of sounds clashing between the bass and the thing here, but you want the pads to sound nice and rich throughout here because everything's fading out. So then a de-esser would be very good, or a dynamic EQ, which we'll talk about a little later, is also a good option to do that, because then again we're only taming the high peaks with this, but anytime it passes here, we're not dulling this section here, right? We're allowing this section to stay full and complete, but only dealing with this problem here when we know it's going to be an issue because the bass and the pad are both going to be clashing. So this just allows us a very cool pumping feeling without dulling things, and allows us to tame those problem frequencies without taking the life out of it, which is a very nice thing. And okay, so how is it used? That's all the de-esser stuff. It's a pretty great plugin. I'll use it very, 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 very often. Sometimes sometimes on all 8 tracks of a stem master. It's not uncommon. So then frequency. So regular EQ, I'm not going to talk about a whole lot. There's a lot of different kinds of EQs out there. We'll just kind of keep it pretty straightforward with, that 8-band linear EQ is your best one. The next one I want to talk about is a dynamic EQ. And this basically works similar to a sidechain compressor, but rather than compressing, it focuses on ducking or volume reduction. Like compressors, which we'll talk about in a little bit, don't really just turn the volume down. They kind of just compress the signal and make it all flat without turning the volume down. But what happens here is with a dynamic EQ is its actual gain reduction or volume reduction. So it's a little bit of a different process. So they have a little bit of a different sound, and some can be better used for some settings and some can be better used for other settings. So a dynamic EQ here, my favorite one again is the Oxford dynamic EQ. I think it's a very good one. But again, any dynamic EQ is really going to react the same, and it's basically like what you have is you've got an EQ that reacts kind of like a sidechain compressor does. So if we play the signal here, we see those problem things. We can then do this, and we can set our threshold just like a compressor, and that allows us to duck out those problems as soon as they hit. But when it's not above that threshold, then it just sits back and relaxes and waits for problem frequencies to show up. And so this is a very great way to add a nice pumping, pushing, pulling feel to your song, and tame your peaks at the same time, essentially, because that's what a good mix is. There's a lot of like back and forth, push and pull. There's a lot of contrast, right? So this is a real good way to balance that contrast without taking it away on the other end of when things get too quiet, right? Otherwise, if all you do is just cut out these frequencies, if you focus on just mastering the drop and you cut out all these frequencies and then you go to working on the quiet part of your song, well, then you've cut out all these frequencies that may have been the space and the life of your breakdown, right? And well, then you're kind of like, well, damn, now the drop sounds good, but my breakdown sounds like trash. And then you could split them and EQ them differently, which is a total way to go about it. And sometimes that's what I will do. But I find sometimes to get that nice pumping thing, to deal with those transients a little bit more, it kind of just helps with a nice pumping feel and pushing pull feel to the track, like I keep saying. Yeah, Izotope does have a great one, actually. I use that one on occasion as well. And yeah, so that's kind of all I want to go over for dynamic EQ, because it's not the most complicated thing. Sidechain compression, is another thing I want to talk about to deal with some problem frequencies. And a lot of people think this is just a kick and bass relationship kind of thing. And it's like, okay, well, again, that's an option, but it can be used for so much more. Oftentimes I'll use some sort of sidechain compression. If, say, for instance, pads and a vocal are clashing and I want that pad to be present, but I want those vocals to be the focus point, well, then oftentimes what you can do is kind of use a little bit of sidechain compression on the on the pads, so that way anytime the vocals go above a threshold, then the pad gets reduced a little bit, and that way you kind of just get to hear a little bit of a pushing and pulling feel that the pads then stay present when the vocal's not there, but when the vocals come in, then the pads are like, okay, I'm going to hide a little bit and let the vocal do its thing and pop back out. And that can be a very, very beneficial thing. And that leads me to my next and final point, which is like the fancy frequency processors. And this is kind of where we're going to talk about mid-side EQ and all those sorts of things. So there's three main fancy EQ type plugins that I use regularly on a mix. One less than the others, I would say. So I'll show you that one first, I guess. And this one is basically just like a regular EQ, equivocate, but it is a little bit fancier in the sense that it has 26 bands, and it allows you to, sort of split your bands in all sorts of ways, and you can just really fine tune the curve with this thing, and it allows you to just even kind of just change your things all sorts of size. So you can even have like literally I can have a range that is 0 to 1 hertz if I wanted, which is the most absurd thing that you would never need. But it's cool to have that capabilities for if there's any real problem frequencies top up, because when you're dealing with these sorts of things, then you kind of want that real fine tuning precision. And this one, I'll only use it when I absolutely need to, kind of thing. It's kind of just something to help carve out some problems. Another one that I use on a regular basis is this thing called Track Spacer. And this is a pretty great plugin, because what this allows me to do, I'll actually show you it in Ableton because it'll make a lot more sense in Ableton, just because it's easier to route the side chaining thing. And what Track Spacer does, is basically a side chain dynamic EQ. And so what we can do here is, so if I've got this bass sound here that I'll just use stylophone, that'll be my trigger. So if I put my sidechain trigger to this stylophone thing here, oh yeah, so someone knows it. Yeah, Track Spacer is amazing. Yeah, it's great. It allows you to just basically set up a little bit of a filter here and use it as kind of a dynamic EQ. So anytime this bass initially hits, where is this thing? Of course, the bass isn't going to be playing right now. So now that I've got it triggered, my sound choice is awful right now. I apologize for that. But so essentially, we'll see the bass triggers, and it's acting as a sidechain. It's acting as like a sidechain dynamic EQ, focusing on only the frequencies where the bass is going above. And so, like, obviously, I want the low end of that bass to hit and not really do anything. So it's kind of, it allows you to clean things up to a specific frequency, and then you even have these extra little controls here. We have your attack and release, and you can kind of fiddle with things a little bit more. You can even make it mid-side to kind of just rather than left and right, and it allows you to do a whole. It's very easy to use, and it's very easy to just sort of carve out some space for key points. And the next one I want to talk about, which is essentially my meat and potatoes for dealing with problem frequencies, and this is a amazing plugin called Soothe 2, or Soothe 1 is also good, but this one's a little bit better. And what's amazing about this thing is it's got great mid-side capabilities. So just show this sound, for example. Is this the one I'm working on? Yeah. Nope, it's not. Okay, we'll just show this guy here. And so here we go. When we check out this pad here, again, we know that there's problem frequencies there and it goes sweeping up. But what we can do is we can, one, change the sharp, like the depth of this. We can change the sharpness, so we see our peaks get way sharper as we do things, or just very flat, coming out big round things. It's got great mid-side capabilities. So with this thing, I can kind of set the balance that it's now reacting on the mids more than the sides, or now it's reacting on the sides more than the mid, and each band has its own balance, right? So this side's reacting on the mids more than the sides, and this side's the opposite, right? So you can do all sorts of crazy things, change the selectivity, change the wet and dry. You've got envelope controls. Like, it is my go-to. Yeah, Soothe is definitely not a cheap one. It's not necessary either. The one thing I will say about Soothe is it's a great plugin, but it does add something to the mix. It's not transparent, and that's why oftentimes I will use the suppressor or the dynamic EQ, because they don't add anything to the mix. This soothe is doing something behind the scenes that it just sometimes it's amazing. Sometimes it adds color where you're just like, this is what it needs. But other times it just adds a little bit of harshness or color, and you're like, or it just dulls it in this way. Or you're like, sometimes it's just not the magic bullet, but it can be. It very much can be. But that's sort of all I want to talk about these fancy EQing plugins. They're they're great tools, but honestly speaking, with a de-esser, a good dynamic EQ, and basic sidechain compression, and just good EQing, that's all you need for a good mix. These are all a little bit of icing on the cake that sometimes helps speed up the process, and sometimes they very much help in a mastering procedure where if I'm all I have is a stereo master, then I have to get really fancy with something like this. But if you're doing it in a mix, this is much, much, much less needed, right? This is something the main reason I bought it is because occasionally I will get a stereo master that's just so far gone, and files could have been deleted or lost along the way. And it's like, okay, well, there are things I can do to save it or whatever. And this is just a little bit of that extra sauce to kind of salvage some maybe unsalvageable things. But at the same time, you don't really want to be doing that best case scenario. You want to have things done right, and then that way you don't have to deal with salvaging unsalvageable kind of thing. But it is a very powerful tool to have. Then last thing I want to talk about is just explain mid-side EQ a little bit better for anyone that wants to learn it, because I think it's a very valuable tool that is also most often used in my thing. So mid-side EQ is essentially allows you to have basically two different bands for the middle of the spectrum and for the top of the spectrum. So for the middle, let's say I want it down to 60 hertz, but for the top, I can then cut things out. What do I use that? Cut things out, do less of a steep slope, and go even higher. And I can, maybe boost some highs here and cut some mids out. But then on the mids, I can then, keep the mids neutral, but then take out some top shelf or whatever. So it just allows you to sculpt it differently, and that's gonna very much help the stereo image of the space. But it can also be very good for taming out, great space. So like if you want the vocals to sit center, but you still want these to be wide, well, then you can use mid-side EQ to scoop out some sections in the middle, but don't do anything to the sides. And that way you're carving out space for the vocals in the middle, but you're not taking away anything from the actual sound itself, right? And that's a good balance without just cutting it all out. But that's all I'll really say about that, because it's powerful, but not overly that complicated. And so onward, that's pretty much all I'm going to say about frequency processing. Those fancy frequency processors are fun, but like I say, a dynamic EQ and a de-esser and regular EQ and sidechain compression, like that's all you need for a good quality mix. So now we're getting into dynamics, which is the real, not the fun stuff, I guess, but it's just as important as everything else. So essentially, this is, compression limiting, all that sort of fun stuff. What is dynamic processing? Well, the first thing I want to talk about is transient shapers, actually, because they are, dealing with dynamics. Sometimes you want things to be more or less punchy, and compression is more often than not something I'll use to fix that issue, or, more often than not, that's kind of what I want. But sometimes things really need just an extra bit of a transient or really dull things or whatever, and this can be a very great tool that not a lot of people kind of think of. And I really love the kilohertz transient shaper, because it's just transient, okay, whatever, transient, it's just got so many different options. So when you look at it, like it allows you to actually even have kind of like a bit of an envelope to your thing. You can add this pump and sustain. So like it gives you a lot more control than most transient shapers. But at the same time, for the longest time, I pretty much just exclusively used this free Bittersweet plugin that I'm pretty sure is still free. And, it's got 3 different settings, fast, medium, slow, and you can all sort of punch it. And it also kind of has a little bit of a envelope of some sort and control. So like, any transient shaper is good for solving a little bit of those issues. But again, most often of the time I'll go to a compressor. And so That's the next point. Compression. So what essentially is a compressor? What does it do? Well, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I will go over just all the basic parameters so that way everyone knows everything that a compressor can actually do for them. And so what does a compressor do? Well, if you think about it, it reduces it tames the dynamic range of a sound. And so there's three things a compressor does very well. Is it can reshape the envelope, like add punch or snap to a sound, which is what we were just talking about with the transient shaper. It can, bring out fullness or weight to a track by sort of bringing down those loud points and emphasizing things to all the same volume. Then it brings up a little bit of warmth, and all that sort of lower noise that was hidden is now a bit more present. And it can just again tame the dynamics or tame harsh transients and peaks in a mix. And so I want to just kind of go over a little bit of the concepts that a compressor has in Ableton, just to really reiterate what they can do. And it'll be nice and quick for the people that already know, and the people that don't, it'll be good. So ratio just refers to the amount that it's getting compressed. So 2-to-1 ratio is getting compressed twice as much. A 4-to-1 ratio is getting compressed twice as much as a 4-to-1. An 8-to-1 ratio is getting compressed, twice as much as a 4-to-1 ratio, and it goes on and on and on up to infinity. And essentially an infinity 1 ratio is just a limiter. It means that there is no give and take. Once it's not allowed to pass that threshold one bit. With a 2-to-1 or a 4-to-1 or whatever else, then there's a little bit of give. The threshold's like not a brick wall. It can't pass this line. And so that brings me to, what is the threshold? Basically, it's a level range that our signal is set at. So anytime the input signal goes above this minus 8 dBs, then the compressor is going to be racked. But let's say, so here in this example, we hear that the sound is playing, but the input isn't actually going above our minus 8 dB. So the compressor isn't doing anything. But then when we bring it down to that threshold, we then start to hear we're getting some gain reduction. And so that's essentially what the threshold does, is it sets the level. Anytime it passes that level, then it's going to do some gain reduction based on the ratio that you've set. And so then at that point, the envelopes are basically the attack and release are basically your envelopes. It's how fast you want the compressor to react. So with a 0 millisecond, the second it passes that threshold, the compressor's reacting. With a longer attack, it's going to take 50 milliseconds, 100 milliseconds, however long after that signal's passed to react. And release, same thing. How quick it takes to fade out and how long it takes to fade out, kind of thing. Next I want to talk about is this knee. And the reason I want to use Ableton's compressor is because the knee is very visually appealing here. So what we can see here is it kind of like with a knee of 1 or of 0, it is a very sharp, instant kind of, oh yeah, no, thanks for coming in. I appreciate you coming in. Enjoy your dinner. But anyway, so the knee is essentially how sharp the compressor is going to react. So again, once it passes that threshold, then it's instant. Boop. But with a knee of this, you can start to see it curves it a little bit, right? So it allows for a bit of a smoother style of compression. And sometimes you want either. Sometimes you want a punchier thing. Sometimes you want smoother. Depends on what you're looking for. The envelope type here is, it's got two options: logarithmic or linear. And essentially the linear, you can think about it as just a flat line. The compressor starts here and moves there. It follows the exact same signal path. But when you go to a logarithmic path, then you start to get this more curved kind of signal where it goes zoop. So that logarithmic path can be a little bit more punchy and can be very good for drums, but that linear path is just a little bit smooth or a little bit smoother. And similarly, peak and RMS style compression, that's another sort of similar concept. The peak compression is anytime it goes above that specific threshold, then it's taming that peak on a transient by transient or on a peak by peak basis. But what RMS does is it takes like a root mean squared average of the entire track and then bases the threshold rate off of that and then compresses based on that root mean squared as opposed to an individual peak. So RMS is generally known as a softer style of compression than peak. All of that may have sounded confusing, but essentially these three things all allow you to make it a sharper or a softer style of compressor, right? And that can be very good to have all those different options to make it very smooth or not as smooth. Final thing I want to say is Ableton automatically has this makeup gain on. the auto makeup gainer is terrible on 90% of plugins, so I always just manually gain match myself because it's generally a lot more consistent. So again, a lot of that may have been repetition for some people, but the reason I wanted to repeat it is to specifically talk about knee, the envelope type, and the peak versus RMS thing, because those are three very important overlooked things of a compressor that, again, like this little knob here can make or break the difference between a punchy drum or kind of a dull sounding drum, right? It can do a lot. And so that kind of brings me on to my next point of, now that we know essentially what a compressor is and what it does, I want to talk about glue compression a little bit, because there's all sorts of different ways to use a compressor. So one of the most important topics in mastering is glue compression. What essentially does glue compression mean? Well, thankfully the name is pretty self-explanatory. It's a style of compression that is meant to cohesively gel or glue a mix together to make it sound like one full sound. And so oftentimes my go-to bus compressor is this, where is it here? It's this slate red here, which was a emulation of the Focusrite, the Focusrite red. Nope, that's not the right one. It's an emulation of the Focusrite red compressor that Chris Lord-Alge made famous for using on a lot of his mix, and it's a VCA style of compressor, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Red, there we go. Yeah, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And so the reason I like this compressor is because it's got a little bit of a drive to add some color, and it's very good at taming transients, but it's very subtle at the way it does it. So it adds some great punch and color without taking a lot away. And that's why I very like it, because it's subtle, but yet effective. Oftentimes I'll also use an SSL style compressor, which is, similar to this slate gray. But the type of compressor isn't as important as the settings of a compressor, or, the bus compressor, I should say. So most often my bus compressor settings, I'll just have it a ratio of 1.5. The attack and the release are generally quite slow, because you want it to be very much just gluing things together rather than aggressively shaping things, and then kind of just set the threshold to match. So, and what we're looking for here is about 2 to 3 dBs of gain reduction, ideally. Now, obviously, this track is not EQ'd or processed in any way, so that setting would be changed later. But yeah, exactly, yeah. So, like, if you're compressing something different than this, what I'm talking is bus compression for a stereo master, or for the master channel specifically. If you're compressing different, stems, for instance, compression rate can completely vary. It'll go, oftentimes I'll go aim for around 5 or 6, but sometimes can be more, sometimes can be less. Definitely varies as far as gain reduction I'm going for stems. But yeah, just for the master channel, then I'll go for about a 2 to 3 dBs of a reduction, and I'll set it at those settings. Other bus compressors will be, or other, group compressors will be different settings depending on the instrument, depending on stuff. I don't want to go too much into specific compressor settings for all the different instruments, because I could talk about that for another hour. But I just wanted to show you my general compressor settings for the master channel. It's going to be very gentle, long release, a simple, 1.5 ratio, and just kind of let it sit and simmer everything together. And I'd use the same settings on an SSL gray, right? I kind of push the release slower, the attack would be pretty slow, the threshold would be whatever to get 2 3 dBs of gain, and I'd be at a 1.5 ratio. The setting wouldn't change from my master channel, kind of thing. But let's see, yeah, so that's essentially what I do for glue compression. But there's all sorts of other things I do to glue things together. A lot of people think, the gel and the cohesion comes together in compression, but it comes together through busing, and it comes together through all sorts of other things like tape and sonic coloration and EQing and yada, 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 right? So it's everything that balances together to make a nice mix. But, those are the settings that I'll often use in a glue compressor. And sometimes I'll push it to a 2 ratio. Sometimes I'll play with the attack and release a little bit more to make it a little bit snappier. It depends on the mix, but more often than not, it's a quite slow attack and release, and 1.5 ratio. So then this brings me to what are the different types of compressors. So I've mentioned a little bit that the red one was a VCA sort of style compression, um, and there's actually, yeah, I think it is. I'm drawing a blank off the top of my head, but anyways, the five regular types of compressors that are in existence, and four of these are based off of analog gear, but these days there's a lot of analog emulation that are very, very good, that honest to god, they are just as good as you need for any good mastering purpose. Do they sound absolutely as crystal clear and comparative to the original unit? Well, some are debatable. Some say they are, some say they're not, or whatever, but a lot of them do add color that can very be pleasing in a mix. And so I just want to briefly go over the different kinds of compressors. So the variable mu here is the first style of compressor, and these were reliant on tubes. And so a common one of these would be like the Puig child compressor. It's yeah, no, thanks for coming in. I hope you have a good one. But yeah, so the variable mu is a tube based compressor that, as you would expect from using tubes, it adds a lot of warmth to a mix, but it can be very good for gelling things together. And it's very, or not necessarily gelling things together, but taming, just making it sound balanced and full. So it's a good compressor for just sort of taming some things, but it's also adds a lot of color. So I don't like to use it as a glue compressor too much. An optical style of compressor is like an LA2A or an LA3A style compressor, or it's something that is generally a very slow reacting style compressor. So it's got a very slow attack release, and it can be, it's kind of compared to like the RMS style compression for analog compressors. A VCA style compressor is based off of like a voltage controlled amplifier, and they are generally very sharp because of the amplifier, the analog amplifier, and it just makes, they're very good at taming transients and very good at making things punch and snappy. And then a variable mu compressor is just such a fast compressor. That's like an 1176 style compressor, which just has very, very snappy, like a lot of the slow attack and release times on some of the 1176 style compressors are still faster than a lot of settings on some of these other compressors. That's just how fast and some of them the FET compressors are, because these were made with new age transistors after tubes stopped becoming a thing, and they're just way snappier, way quicker. So the 1176, like I say, is the most common style of and I'll sort of show what some of them all look like to you in the slate emulations, of course. Now all of them are different, but the reason I want to mention all these different kinds of compressors is for a very good reason, is because, like I was talking about specifically for the variable mu style compressors, because of the tubes, they add a lot of color and warmth to a track. Well, so do these other style compressors, right? Like this red is a VCA. This where is it here? This variable mu here. This one here is sort of like our variable mu style of compressor, and this one would add a lot of top end and color and shine to a mix. They all actually color the sound in different ways. And that's all I'm going to say about it for now, because I have a whole section based on that, and I'm going to try and speed through things here because we're chatting here, and I want some time for questions. But that's they all react slightly different, so it's all important to know why they do what they do and what one you use for what setting. Oh, where did I just go? Oh, no. Okay. There we go. Next. Okay. So next I want to talk about is a limiter. I've already discussed this. Limiter is literally just a brick wall compressor that has a ratio of infinity. It is not allowing the signal to pass at all, and is generally the very last thing on my compressor chain or on my mastering chain. So finally, in the last topic here, and this is one of the more important things, which is just like sonic or harmonic coloration to your mix. So this can be anything from preamp emulation, console emulation, those compressors that we were talking about that add color through just the hardwiring of it. And even like an EQ can be sonic coloration if it's the right kind of EQ, which I'll talk about in a bit. So first off, I want to talk about preamp and console emulation. These are probably the simplest out of the thing. I'm just going to exit live here for some processing power. Save. Yep, come on. Okay. So yeah, so preamps and console emulation are probably the simplest because realistically, all it is go open up the mix rack and I'll add some type of preamp, and there's a couple of different preamps that Slate allows me to choose from, but a bunch will have different things. And this one is based on like a German Telefunken. This one is based on like a Neve. This is like a London, similar to like the red style preamp that the Beatles would have used, and so forth and so forth. And similarly, they have console emulations, which is it follows the same pattern, right? You've got your London ones here, which I believe are the red one. This is your USA. I think I can't remember. This one's your Neve one. I think they're slightly different. This one's based off of a Trident console, and this one's based off of a Tube console, right? So they're all based off of very, very famous pieces of hardware recording gear that added great color. And so what we can use this for is literally just add a bit of color. Like for instance, this Neve preamp here is often known to be add a lot of bit of low end and like around 400 hertz and substance to your track. This Telefunken here is really good at just having you can hit the top end pretty hard without it actually like farting or peaking or being aggressive. This London style, this red style preamp here is very good at adding a lot of top end. So what you can do is sometimes, you'd think, oh, it's missing a little bit of this frequency. Well, let me just EQ it back in there. But oftentimes using things called non-linear processing, which is what this is, it's basically like processors that aren't reacting very straight, because a digital compressor or things are very linear. They happen, and their goal is to not color the sound at all. They want to do what they're meant to do and nothing else. But these non-linear processors, like those different compressors I was talking about, they don't follow those same rules. They are designed and engineered to affect the frequency spectrum in a very minute but noticeable way. And so that's a very, very good way to add a lot of color and warmth. Is it processing in time? Probably stretching and shortening for you. They all do different sorts of things. The algorithms are very, very complex. I'm not even going to begin to even understand how they work, because some of these, like for instance, this new compressor here, Slate worked on. This is like an LA two-way style compressor. I think Slate worked on the algorithm for this for, what was it, 3 years, three or 4 years before they finally found something that they were happy with that matched the original sound of an LA two-way style compressor. So the algorithms are just so far complex that I'm not even going to begin to know what's going on there. But because of that, they sound good, which is what all I care about. So next I want to talk about is tape. Tape is a very confusing one because it uses magnets to make the sound do things, and even I don't fully understand how tape works, but I understand the concepts of it, and it's a pretty crazy reality. But what I like to use tape for is oftentimes I'll use it on the master channel, and oftentimes I'll use it on the stems. I'll use it everywhere. But what is very good about tape, oftentimes for the master channel purpose specifically, and as you can see, I'm a big Slate fan. I find all their stuff very good, and for $15 a month, I can't go wrong. But anyways, so the tape machine here, Slate one's nice because it has two different kinds of tape machines to choose from. You have your different settings, and you've got a little bit of fanciness here. I find for mastering settings, any extra fanciness like wow and flutter and noise reduction, I'll generally remove that all the way. For mastering a track, I find tape really, you almost always need to reduce the bass at least 2 or 3 dBs with this one at least. General rule of thumb, these are just two different kinds of tape machines, and they all react differently. The speed is a little bit different. Generally for processing stems, I'll use a faster speed, but mastering, I'll use a slower speed. Kind of depends on the track, but it can add a lot of color. And the best way I can say is probably just like whatever tape plugin you have, just read the manual on what it's trying to emulate and what it's meant to do, because all tape, some are mastering tape machines, some are more meant for, not quite the mastering process. Some are like, there's also like, there's just different kinds of tape machines that use different style of tape, and they just naturally color the sound differently, right? Like I have 2 different machines here, but there's also 2 different kinds of tape. So that all does things to the sound that is, maybe it'll add more low end, maybe it'll add more sheen, maybe it'll do something to the mid range. Each one does something slightly different, right? So it's just important to know what tape you're using and what it's going to do to the sound, but it can very much help things in a lot of places. And one thing I find that's universal about tape is it rolls off. Generally, it has like a roll off around 16 kilohertz, just because that's how tape was. It's not really meant to produce frequencies much higher than that. So, if you find that the high end's a real problem with your track or something, then tape can be a really nice way to please that or get rid of that, instead of using an EQ cut or a top end, just filter or something like that. You can just use this as a filter and add a little bit of coloration and clean it up that way. And that's all I'm really going to say about tape. So I've already mentioned a little bit about nonlinear processing and what it essentially is, and I'll just repeat it again because it is very, very important. Basically, like, it's meant to color the sound. These compressors, these EQs, if I go back to my virtual mix rack in Slate here, virtual mix rack, you can see all this different compressors, but these different EQs are all meant to do things. And like the CS EQ is is going to react differently than this FGA EQ, which I believe is the London style EQ, right? And so their boosts, their cuts, their bells, their curves, everything is going to be different than the other, and they're all going to react to the sound differently. So oftentimes when I'm doing a mix, I will actually cycle out different compressors, be like, okay, does this compressor sound better than this style of compressor? I'll have the settings set to about the same, but just from flipping from one compressor to another, from 1176 to a Neve, or just all these different options, one will naturally sound better than the other. And over time you start to learn which compressors you want for which settings and stuff like that. But the key concept is these compressors color the sound in a pleasing way when used properly, and also similarly they can compress and color the sound in an unpleasing way when used improperly, right? So it's just important to understand what these compressors and how the color is actually reacting, and whether you want the more top end that compressor might relieve, or maybe you want a more dull compressor that is going to still compress things but not have color on the top end like a variable mu style would, right? So these are all things that are getting into the nitty gritty of mastering and mixing, but are definitely, key for getting that shimmer. Nonlinear processing is the most important concept for getting that, like, that sheen that everybody talks about. Oh no, don't want to open that. Oh no, I just opened a game. Okay, well, we'll just exit that in 1 sec. All right. Okay, so that's nonlinear processing, and yeah, and so that's basically the entire session. I wanted to offer anybody who showed this, or who came and enjoyed this, basically, there's a free 30-minute session with me for whoever wants. We can go through, sit down, talk about one of your mixes, figure out where the problems are, maybe even fix them together. Just whatever you think might be valuable, we can figure out the best way to use 30 minutes is just sort of a thank you for coming to the session. And yeah, I hope this was valuable to all of you, or at least some of you. And yeah, we got some, I think we're opening up for some questions now.
All righty, dude. So thank you. First of all, thank you so much. And thank you for this offer. I'm sure everyone will jump on it in a sec. So just before we start with the Q&A, I just wanted to apologize for everyone who, got in the middle of the session, and we really tried to spread the word in the last minute about the change of times, okay? Because we didn't know that we have this, how do we call it, Dan? Like
the timing messes. Yeah, I don't even know.
Yeah. So basically, in US and Canada, I had like a change of times. They moved their clock 1 hour forward, and we didn't know it was today. So I just wanted to say that this session is recorded, and we will upload it to YouTube in just a few days, so you can watch the whole thing. And so I think the best way to go with the Q&A is that we will just start write questions in the chat, and you can scroll it over there, right, and answer until anyone, until we kind of figure out it's time to go. But may I please start with the first question? I really don't know anything. I'm probably gonna say it wrong about LUFS or Lufus. If you can just say a few words about it, because I feel like it's very important for mastering.
Yes, good concept. And that was something I actually wanted to touch upon, but I didn't make a slide. So thank you for asking about it.
Sure thing.
So essentially LUFS stands for perceived human loudness, is essentially, that's not what the acronym stands for, but that's basically the concept you need to understand is perceived loudness. It's not dB range, it's not volume, it's how the human ear is perceiving it as loud. And so songs that are very compressed and very limited, well, they have a very loud noise floor, and they've got all sorts of things that the quiet parts are brought up very heavily, and that it may hit at the same dB range because it's compressed and limited to not go above 0 dB, but the perceived loudness of that song is then more than another song. And so, well, what does that mean for mastering? Well, historically in mastering there was what they called the loudness war, and that loudness war was basically, as mixes got more and more progressed and technology got better, people just started pushing their mixes louder and louder and louder because there was no industry standard as to how loud a mix should be. And what ended up happening was then on TV and commercials and stuff, what would happen is basically you'd be watching your TV program at regular volume or whatever, and then all of a sudden an ad would come on and it'd be like, blah, 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 just screaming at you so heavily. And then so, they needed to make up some standards so that that wouldn't just destroy speakers, cause problems, just like aggravate the general population, all sorts of things. So then they developed this standard or the broadcasting standard, and what they then use to measure that is what we call perceived loudness, or LUFS. And for those that are interested, there's a free loudness meter called the Ulean loudness meter. This one's great. And so if we just sort of play some stems here, we'll get a reading of what loudness we're playing here. Okay, so you can see right now we're hitting around minus 24 or minus 24 LUFS, and integrated and short term we're hitting at minus 26. So short term is as it sounds, short term. Integrated is everything peaked together. And basically the main thing you want to know about loudness when it comes to music is the loudness war has ended. There is no more fighting to get things at minus 6 LUFS anymore. That is generally, if you're mixing for loudness, oftentimes, especially if you're going to be putting stuff out on Spotify, that is only hurting your mixes, because what things do is Spotify is set at a hardwired minus 14 LUFS. I think Tidal is minus 16. Pandora's maybe minus 12, but those are the limits. They don't go below minus 12 and they don't go above minus 16. So that means anything you post on a streaming service is going to be at that level. Whether it's on Spotify, it'll be minus 14. Whether you have your song mastered and sounding at minus 6 LUFS, if you put it on Spotify, it's then going to compress it and balance it out. And because it's such a drastic change from minus 6 to minus 14, it's going to sound very different. And so essentially, what does that mean, and what should you aim for? Should you aim for a minus 14 all the time? Well, not necessarily either, because sometimes that just doesn't provide you the best result for your song. You don't really want to mix based on loudness. So, basically what you want to do is just aim for the best sounding mix you can that's around that level, and you want to just ignore the whole concept of loudness altogether, realistically. And if your mix sounds good and you don't really worry or don't really focus on the loudness, then generally you'll probably be within the range that you're looking for. But if you're like, no, I need to make my mix loud, what can I do? I'm going to squash this section here to bring it up louder, then that's when you're going to introduce these problems when it transfers over to Spotify. And there are still a lot of engineers and a lot of songs that do that. So if you want to do a mix like that for, say you want a DJ or something like that, then that's still, there is value in that without a doubt. But the reason why the loudness war has kind of ended in the whole industry is because of Spotify, and all these streaming platforms have now set a limit on how loud they're actually going to be streaming stuff at. So if you don't follow their rules, well, then you're kind of just getting hurt. And that's pretty much all I got to say about loudness.
Awesome. Thank you so much, man. Guys, if you have any other questions, this is the time to write them on the chat.
Yes, so just post them in there. I'll be reading them away. And what makes your mix not a turd? Well, basically just no major problems, no major issues. And, what constitutes a turd for one person is different than the other ones, for other people. So it's like, it really depends. And there's you just got to do the best you can, right? There's, you know, and especially if you're working with a nice mastering engineer, and some of them are not as nice, but most of them I know, if they find big problems that need to be fixed in the mix, they'll be like, hey, you know, like this is a problem that I think should be fixed in the mix. You know, like we'll fix it in the mix and then resend the stem to me, and we'll get things going. There's no, you know, there's doesn't, you know, there's no, yeah, it's hard to really answer what's a turd, but none of your guys' tracks are turds from what I've heard. Um, but okay, so should you cut? Let me see. So should you cut frequencies to avoid masking and pan tracks left and right, or pick one or the other? So yeah, generally it's going to be a bit of the both, and sometimes a little bit of something different. So it kind of depends on what the song would specifically need. Oftentimes I use an EQ first to see if that can solve the issue, because that's the simplest process. And what I like to do is keep things as simple as possible until I need to push things more. So that's why I'll start with an EQ, because that's the simplest tool, or a De-Esser because I know that's very simple if I find an obvious problem. But if I don't need to do dynamic EQing or any panning like that, I won't necessarily have to, because ideally that's something that should be done in the mix. But at the same time, I will often always pan things, you know, left and right, and do some cutting as well, I would say. But you know, if you pan things, that just means you need to cut a little bit less than you would have if you just kept it and cut it. So if you're doing both, then you just have to sort of split the difference and do a little bit less processing over different things. And I find that's a very good way about mixing, is doing a lot of small things rather than a bunch of big things. So I don't master to their level. Not often. Like a lot of the times I'll aim for that. A lot of the times, like when I'm mastering, I always have a loudness and I'll aim for around -14. And like generally on my output volume, like oftentimes I have a little bit of give. Sometimes I'll export the song at -1 dBs. Sometimes I'll export it at -2 dBs if it's a really loud song that I just want to be, you know, a smaller perceived loudness. But oftentimes I don't focus on it. You know, if it's too LUFS louder, I'm not going to be like, oh no, I need to do what I can to fix this song or export it at a lower volume or whatever. That I find also can introduce a little bit of issues as well. So you kind of just want to mix based on how it sounds and how good it is, and you know, worry about being within a range of the LUFS that's not too far away from what it should be, because you know what the initial problem is, or what the real problem is when you're dealing with a -8 or -6 LUFS and you bring it down to -14. But if you're going from -12 to 14, or that's not really going to cause you any noticeable issues when it comes down to things. So what's the difference between 50% mono and 50% stereo in utility? So in Ableton's utility, I'm going to have to go check that. I'll get back to you on that one. I thought if the mono was engaged, then no matter what, it was always going to be mono, and the wet dry was only for the stereo, but that I'm not positive on. So I'll have to read Ableton's manual to get back to you on that one. But I'll figure that out for our session. How do you choose what level to go for? Okay, so that is depending on, so I basically ignore level completely until I'm almost done my mastering process. And generally at that point, things kind of generally just settle around the -12 to -16. So that's generally what I go for. There are some times where the track, you know, like some heavy, you know, electronic tracks, they just want to be pushed at -10 or whatever. Very rarely will I go below -10. That's kind of like, even that is kind of pushing it for me. Generally, I like to do a -12 to 16 within the range, but as long as I'm within that range of, you know, 11, 12 to 16, I'm happy. Silly question. Panning is something that also is done in mastering. Yeah, so panning is generally something that's done in the mix most often. But if I'm doing something like a stereo master, where again I have these, you know, stems of the track, the bass, the drums, and whatever. If I find that there's two stems that may do good from panning, then I'll often pan them. And you know, that's kind of a not as often in mastering, but it's definitely something that can be done in stereo mastering. But more often than not, it's definitely more of a mixing thing. Start with tracks at 0 dB, gain reduction. So generally when people export me, or when I get people to send me stems, I have them do all the gain matching and gain staging beforehand. So that's a good question. I like to have the master peaking at around -8 dB all said and done. So if we take this song as an example here, You see now it's peaking at a minus 7.2 whatever, so this is good. I actually did a pretty trashy job of exporting these stems and whatever, because you see I had to turn the volume down, and so these would be too loud for my standards if they were just like this, because, well, you know, it's hitting there. It's manageable, but it's not really ideal. So generally what I like for is the stem volume doesn't necessarily matter, but the overall master volume matters. And obviously, if one specific stem is peaking over 0 dBs, then that's a problem. But generally, in my projects, I have things just set at 0 dBs right off the bat, and then people export the stems to me. And I find it's always best to have them exported properly rather than me just fix things on my own after the fact. So generally I'll just I'll get people to have the stems exported properly, and that gets them in the process of mixing their songs with their stems at the proper volume, which generally gets a better mix for the other people. So oftentimes, like when I'm mixing a song, everything's brought way down to at least 8 dBs to start off, or minus 8 dBs. And oftentimes I'll have tracks sitting at minus 14, minus 20, and I'll just sort of crank up the gain on my monitor mix to make it sound loud enough. And then when I'm mastering, I kind of just toggle back the gain and balance it back that way. But I find when you're working within that, that minus 8 dB head range in the mix, generally you get a lot better results, because oftentimes if you're redlining when you're mixing, I've ran into so many problems where I was just working on a mix the other day where it was just somehow it was peaking 6 dB and they weren't able to fix stems, and it was just a disaster. So that all could have been avoided had they just been working in a properly gain stage mix to begin with. So that's why I always say, whenever I'm mixing or starting a song, I'll always take that down from 0 dB and bring it down to a minus 8 to start off my mixing process. Like I say, for mastering, it's a bit different because I like that to be done in the mixing process, but that's kind of where I'm at with that one. Yeah, so that looks like all the questions. Unless there's any final questions, I want to thank all of you for coming and staying. It went a little bit longer than I anticipated, but I get talking about mastering and I just keep going on and lose track of time. So that happens once or twice in my life. So it'll probably happen again.
Okay, Dan. So I want to thank you again so much for coming and talking and taking the time. I think we learned a lot. And if anyone wants to follow Dan or, get these 30 minutes, where can we find you?
Yeah, you can find me Instagram. I haven't been as active on there recently, but I still like to chat with people, and I'm I just got a new module today, so expect some posts coming soon from that. But yeah, Instagram's a good place to reach me. I'll put my email here in the chat here for anybody that wants to just email me. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure I recognize a lot of you, so I'll be chatting out to you, and just reach out to me on Instagram, reach out to me via email.
That's an email, what you sent
Oh,
here?
that's my website. My goodness.
That's a website. Yeah.
There's my email. Okay, there we go.
All right. So if anyone wants to, it's on the chat, the
Contact
email.
Where and yeah, I look forward to meeting with as many of you as possible about this.
Awesome. So guys, we just concluded our first Netvio Skillshare workshop. Thank you so much for being here. And every month we're going to have something like that. Okay. Like next month, we're going to have different guests with a different subject related to the music industry. And that's it. And I wish you all a wonderful week.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Etienne, for hosting this.